Good morning. Thanks for joining me for morning manna today. Got my flannel shirt on because it's snows a coming. So in John chapter 8, I would like to read this verse to you this morning. Jesus spoke to them, John 8, verse 12, again saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. In Ecclesiastes 2, verse 14, Solomon writes that fools walk in darkness. Now, this is all laid against where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. In the Proverbs 4 verse 19, the way of the wicked is like darkness. They don't know what makes them stumble. It's interesting, isn't it? Stumbling in darkness, not knowing why. But a real warning in Proverbs 2, well, those are warnings, exhortations, of course they are. But in Proverbs 2, the 13th verse there, the writer says or warns to not leave the paths of righteousness or uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness. Let me just say that again. Don't leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. And I was pondering these things this morning, these types of verses this morning. And I was reminded of a time where I have never been so fearful in my life. And it was about 25 years ago. We were living in Mexico, in just this delightful spot in rural Mexico. And a friend of ours, Greg Eckler, an old rock and roller from the days of the 70s, and a fella involved in ministry, a really neat fella, and a few years older than me at that point in time. And he was involved in a lot of ministry at the Pelican Bay prison, one of the federal prisons. It's a pretty tough spot. I'd never been there. That's a good thing. But a pretty tough spot. And Greg was there frequently, involved in ministry, and knew many of the inmates, and was just very active there at Pelican Bay prison. And Greg was coming down to Mexico to see us and spend a week or so with us there. And somehow, through a friend of a friend, one of those type of situations, he had a friend of a friend who was an American who was in prison in the La Mesa prison in Tijuana. And it's a federal prison, Mexico, which exists no more, from what I understand. Was completely razed. But Greg asked me if I wanted to go with him and visit this friend of a friend. And I said, sure, I'll go. So we drove over the drive to Tijuana, a couple hours away. And it was there we met up with the fellow, a friend of a friend of a friend type of thing, who was going to escort Greg and I into the prison. This fellow had been to that prison many, many times. And he told us to, after a bit of an introduction and being searched to make sure we had nothing illegal upon us or tempting upon us, even to the point of taking off our rings and watches, nothing that could be worth anything of value. His final warning was, do not lose contact with me. He said, if you lose contact, you're on your own in here. And I'm thinking, okay, got it. And when we truly descended, and I choose that word purposefully, into that prison, I had never seen anything like that. And I won't go into all the details of that for many reasons, but it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. The darkness. Oh, I'm not talking an absence of physical light, though there were some shadows that were a little bit unnerving. but the darkness of unrighteousness. It was absolutely, as I said, it was absolutely terrifying. And there was no way I wanted to leave the path of the friend of Greg's who was leading us. And I was absolutely making physical contact with him and Greg at all times because of the darkness. And it still sends chills up my neck a little bit, even right now as I speak of it. You know, don't leave the path of uprightness. It's just a warning there. That's all this is. Don't leave that path. Because somehow, when I was reflecting back this morning, all these men who the Lord loves dearly and died for also, these men, step by step, left a certain path of rightness and descended into a darkness that was horrible, absolutely horrible. You know, in the book of Colossians, this is just a simple study this morning. Of course, they all are. But in Colossians, the first chapter, Paul writes regarding Jesus that he has delivered us. Colossians 1:13, he's delivered us from the power of darkness. How'd those fellas get there? There was a power of darkness that got a hold of them. And Jesus has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us, just moved us right in to the kingdom of the Son of his love. Think of that. In whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. You know, Peter writes similarly in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, you are a chosen generation, a